Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today, we're going to be diving deep into the Golden Age of Piracy, with Frank Sherry's Raiders and Rebels as our guide.
Oh, fantastic choice. It really kind of dismantles a lot of those romanticized notions we have about pirates. Sherry digs into the historical context, and what you find is a world of really stark contrast. You have dazzling progress in so many areas, but right alongside it, you have brutal inequality.
Right, and that's kind of where the pirates come in, right? I mean,
Yeah.
they weren't just after treasure, they were rebelling against a system that really didn't offer them much opportunity.
Exactly. And, the book kind of kicks off with Tsar Peter the Great's European tour back in 1697. And what's fascinating is that he witnesses both the brilliance of the age. You've got Isaac Newton unlocking the secrets of the universe. You've got this explosion of art and science and music. But at the same time, he's confronted with just horrifying poverty and suffering. Sherry brings up London's gin lane, where gin was actually cheaper than bread. Just a really striking example of the kind of disparities that existed.
Yeah, so you have this backdrop of societal extremes, and that's what sets the stage for the rise of piracy. It's almost like a powder keg just waiting to explode.
Precisely. And Sherry really skillfully traces this evolution from privateering, which was, a legal and often celebrated activity, to full-blown piracy. And one of the key things he highlights are the Navigation Acts, which basically forced the American colonies to trade exclusively with England, often at terms that were really unfavorable to the colonists.
These acts, which were intended to strengthen England's control, actually fueled resentment and kind of inadvertently pushed these colonial merchants towards more lucrative but illegal options.
It's a classic example of unintended consequences. These merchants are already feeling the squeeze from these regulations, and they start to see privateering and even outright piracy as a way to break free from these constraints. And Sherry gives us a prime example of this with Captain Thomas too. Initially, he's a successful privateer operating within the bounds of the law, but the lure of the Mughal Empire's riches in the Indian Ocean proves too tempting.
He really epitomizes that shift from legal privateering to outright piracy, driven by both circumstance and, let's be honest, a healthy dose of greed.
Absolutely. But Sherry also subtly underscores the desperation that's fueling a lot of these pirates. Economic hardship was a powerful motivator. This was a time when punishments for even minor offenses on naval ships were incredibly brutal. So for some, turning to piracy was a calculated risk, maybe even a desperate attempt to escape a life of utter misery.
It really makes you rethink that romanticized image of the swashbuckling pirate. There's a much grittier reality beneath the surface.
Oh, absolutely. And Sherry doesn't shy away from that. He describes to death, during a battle with a Mogul ship in vivid detail. It's a reminder that this life, while potentially lucrative, was incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, it wasn't all yo-ho-ho and a bottle of rum. But it wasn't just individuals striking out on their own either, right? There were entire pirate communities, most notably in Madagascar.
Right, and that's where things get really interesting. Madagascar becomes a central character in the story. It was a lawless haven where a unique pirate society flourished.
Yeah, from what I understand, they had their own system of governance, even democratic decision-making processes,
Yeah,
which is pretty surprising considering the general lawlessness we associate with pirates.
it really was. Sherry really emphasizes how they established these systems. Elected captains. They rejected the rigid class distinctions that were common on other ships. They even had their own unique code of conduct. It wasn't just anarchy. There was a deliberate attempt to create a different kind of social order.
It makes you wonder, were they just seeking freedom from oppression, or were they actually trying to build a new society altogether?
It's a fascinating question, and Sherry uses Adam Baldridge to illustrate this. He was a shrewd Scottish trader who supplied the pirates in Madagascar, and Baldridge thrived in this environment. He really blurred the lines between legitimate business and the criminal underworld. It really highlights the complexities of this pirate world and how it attracted individuals from all walks of life.
So we have this fascinating picture emerging, a society of outcasts rebelling against the established order, creating their own rules, and thriving in this remote haven.
Yeah, and that sets the stage for the inevitable clash with the behemoth of the time, the British East India Company. The East India Company, a force to be reckoned with. Sherry really kind of paints this vivid picture of their power and influence in the Indian Ocean, and he details how the rise of piracy was a direct threat to their monopoly.
And how did the pirates manage to hold their own against such a powerful adversary? I mean, at least initially we're talking about a company with its own private army. and the backing of the British Empire.
It's a David and Goliath scenario for sure.
Mhm.
Sherry highlights several factors that contributed to the pirates' early success. First, you have the sheer vastness of the Indian Ocean. It was incredibly difficult for the company to effectively patrol and protect their shipping lanes. And then you have the pirates' agility. Their ships and crews were often faster, more maneuverable, and arguably more ruthless.
And let's not forget about the corruption that Sherry subtly weaves into the narrative. He points out how some colonial officials in America, driven by profit, turned a blind eye to this influx of pirate goods, essentially providing a ready market for their ill-gotten gains.
It's a classic case of how greed and corruption can undermine even the most powerful institutions. And it really sets the stage for the entry of one of the most intriguing figures of this era, Captain William Kidd.
Ah, Captain Kidd. His story really embodies that blurred line between privateering and piracy, initially commissioned to suppress piracy. He eventually succumbs to the allure of the outlaw life. What's fascinating is the debate surrounding his motives. Was he a victim of circumstance, a pawn in a bigger political game, or a pirate at heart all along?
Well, Sherry masterfully lays out the historical context. He details Kidd's commission, the involvement of Lord Bellomont and Thomas Livingston, and all those murky political machinations that surrounded his mission. But he leaves the ultimate interpretation of Kidd's character up to the reader.
And that's what makes Sherry such a compelling historian. He presents the facts and allows us to draw our own conclusions. He recounts those pivotal episodes. Kidd's clashes with the Royal Navy, the capture of the Quedagh merchant, and his eventual arrest and execution in London. It's a cautionary tale, really.
Absolutely, and it really signals a turning tide in the fight against piracy. Sherry details these multifaceted efforts to suppress this maritime menace, starting with the crackdown on the trade of pirate goods in the colonies.
Right, that was a major blow to their operations.
Exactly. And then we have Commodore Warren's expedition to Madagascar, which, while not completely wiping out the pirates, it did disrupt their networks and force them to scatter. And then enters perhaps the most formidable pirate hunter of them all, a man who had walked both sides of the line, Woodes Rogers.
Rogers is a fascinating character, a former privateer turned pirate hunter. His life reads like an adventure novel, circumnavigating the globe, rescuing Alexander Selkirk, the real-life Robinson Crusoe, and ultimately becoming the governor of the Bahamas, where he set about pacifying that infamous pirate haven of Nassau.
Talk about a change of scenery, right? And what's particularly insightful is Sherry's analysis of Rogers's methods. He utilized a combination of force and diplomacy, offering pardons to those willing to renounce piracy while simultaneously strengthening defenses and tackling corruption head-on.
So he understood that defeating piracy wasn't just about capturing ships, it was about dismantling the entire system that enabled it.
Precisely. And Sherry details the challenges Rogers faced, outbreaks of plague mutinies, political infighting, and it really highlights his resilience and determination in laying the groundwork for the decline of piracy in the Bahamas.
But despite Rogers' success and the increasing pressure from authorities, the Golden Age of Piracy didn't end overnight.
Wow.
What about those iconic figures, the notorious Blackbeard and Calico Jack, with his audacious female crew members, Anne Bonny and Mary Read?
Their stories, particularly the tales of Anne Bonny and Mary Read, add another layer of complexity to our understanding of piracy. These women defied societal norms, choosing a life of freedom and danger on the high seas.
Their defiance really captures that rebellious spirit that Sherry emphasizes throughout the book. They weren't content to be confined by the roles society dictated for them.
And their stories serve as both a reminder of the allure of the pirate life and the harsh realities that awaited those who dared to challenge the established order.
Because ultimately they met their downfall, right?
Indeed, Blackbeard's reign of terror was brought to a dramatic end in a bloody battle with Lieutenant Robert Maynard, a scene Sherry describes with incredible intensity. And then we have Calico Jack, captured and executed alongside Anne Bonny and Mary. Read their stories, really marking the end of an era.
So we see these larger-than-life figures fall. But what ultimately led to the decline of piracy as a whole? I mean, was it purely down to the efforts of people like Woodes Rogers?
Well, while figures like Rogers played a crucial role, Sherry argues that the decline was much more multifaceted. Increased naval presence and stricter enforcement of laws certainly played a part, and the loss of safe havens like Madagascar, and the crackdown on colonial markets for pirate goods that also significantly weakened their operations.
It seems like a combination of factors that really kind of choked the life out of piracy. But you mentioned something earlier that I found particularly interesting, this idea of a changing social landscape.
Ah, yes. This is where Sherry's analysis goes beyond just, those traditional narratives. He argues that the rise of Enlightenment ideals, with their emphasis on individual rights and liberties, It contributed to a gradual shift in societal attitudes. As living conditions improved for ordinary people, the allure of that outlaw life diminished.
It makes sense if people saw a path to a better life within the existing system. The need to rebel even through piracy wouldn't be as strong.
Exactly. And Sherry masterfully connects this back to the themes he established early on. Remember that stark contrast between societal progress and inequality we talked about?
Right.
Well, those inequalities were slowly being addressed, chipping away at the very foundation of pirate rebellion.
So the pirates, in a way, sowed the seeds of their own demise by highlighting the flaws in the system they contributed to its eventual reform.
It's a fascinating paradox, isn't it? And Sherry doesn't shy away from these complexities. He leaves us pondering the legacy of piracy, acknowledging its brutality, but also recognizing its role in challenging the status quo.
And that's what makes this book, Raiders and Rebels, such a captivating read. It's not just a thrilling account of adventure on the high seas, it's a thought-provoking exploration of a really complex period in history and the enduring allure of rebellion.
He challenges us to look beyond that romanticized image of the pirate and grapple with the nuanced realities of their existence. The desperation, the brutality, the yearning for freedom, and the impact they had on the course of history.
He reminds us that history is rarely black and white, and sometimes it's in those murky gray areas where we find the most compelling stories.
Absolutely, and that's precisely what Sherry delivers, a richly detailed and intellectually stimulating journey into the golden age of piracy.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Frank Sherry's Raiders and Rebels. Your insights have been incredibly illuminating, and I'm sure our listeners will agree.
It's been my pleasure. Raiders and Rebels is a book that sparks curiosity and challenges assumptions. I encourage everyone to dive in and explore this fascinating period for themselves.
Until next time, keep exploring.